They didn't hear the shots that would end their world. They felt the earth itself vomit concrete and steel. Staring through a sliver of gray dawn on the coast of France, an 18-year-old boy named Franz saw the ocean vanish. Not into mist, not into smoke, but under an endless flotilla of battleships, transports, and landing craft. He had a rifle, a concrete box, and an order that would never come. This was the beginning of the longest day. For the men inside the Atlantic Wall, it was the moment their doom was sealed. By the spring of 1944, the Third Reich had turned the coast of Europe into a massive concrete graveyard, the Atlantic Wall. Spanning over 1,000 miles, it was a sprawling skeleton of steel-reinforced bunkers and artillery nests. Berlin's propaganda machine boasted it was an impenetrable shield, a fortress that would shatter any invasion. But for the men who actually lived inside those damp, salt-crusted tombs overlooking the English Channel, it felt more like a cage waiting to be locked. The defenses were powerful, but fragile. Some sections bristled with guns that could sweep the shore. Other parts were just gaps in the line, held together by worn-out soldiers and hopeful lies. These weren't the mythical monsters of Nazi propaganda. They were exhausted reservists, veterans scarred by the Eastern Front, and kids barely old enough to grow a beard. Franz was one of them, scared, alone, and cleaning a weapon he prayed he'd never use. How do you fight for a flag you were forced to salute? He was flanked by OSS battalions, former Soviet conscripts forced into German uniforms, stuck defending a coast that wasn't their home for a cause they never believed in. They lived in a constant state of numb dread, passing time with card games and faded letters home. They all understood a brutal, unspoken truth. Being posted in France wasn't safety. It was just a temporary stay of execution. The real war was waiting for them somewhere else. The waiting itself was a slow form of mental torture. Night patrols moved through moonlit fields. Rumors of a massive Allied invasion drifted through the trenches like smoke. Every distant engine, every odd radio crackle, every shift in the cold wind felt like an omen. Some soldiers slept in their uniforms, weapons in hand, while others chain-smoked in silence beside piles of ammunition. What does it do to a man, knowing the entire weight of the world is about to fall on his head? Then came the quiet before the storm. On the night of June 5th, the silence of the Norman coast was obliterated by a low, horrifying growl that seemed to come from the depths of the sea itself. Thousands of Allied planes roared overhead, the drones shaking the concrete floors. Men poured out of their bunkers, staring up into the abyss. Nobody needed to ask what it meant. The hour had finally arrived. But while the soldiers on the coast watched the sky in terror, the German command structure froze. Field Marshal Rommel was miles away in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday. Hitler was asleep in his mountain retreat, and his officers were too terrified to disturb him. As the gray fog began to burn off on the morning of June 6th, the horizon transformed into something so vast it broke the human mind. The ocean disappeared. In its place was a moving city of steel, the largest invasion fleet ever assembled. For Franz and the defenders of Widerstandsnest 62, the first emotion wasn't panic. It was pure, disorienting awe. It was as if the world itself was sliding towards them through the mist. They weren't just facing an attack, they were facing the end of the world. The sheer scale was impossible to process. At 5:23 a.m., the sky burst into flame. The warships opened fire with a fury that transformed the bunkers into giant bells of roaring concrete. Each impact felt like the planet was being hit by a meteor. Inside, it was chaos. Bags of dust and sand rained from the ceilings. The shattered glass from light bulbs flew through the air. The telephone lines were severed instantly, isolating each position. The men couldn't hear each other scream. They could only feel the shock waves tearing through their boots. For the defenders, the naval bombardment was a sensory nightmare. The air became a thick soup of dust, cordite, and confusion. Many were frozen, waiting for the next hit to bury them alive, convinced the walls were collapsing. What do you do when the only thing between you and hell is a few feet of concrete? And then, the shelling shifted inland. As the smoke cleared, the landing craft appeared in the surf. At about 6:30 a.m., the first American assault waves hit the sand. The defenders had rehearsed this. They had range cards for every fixed point on the beach. Machine guns roared to life from their concealed steel muzzles. Mortars walked their deadly fire across the shoreline. At WN-62, a soldier named Heinrich began firing into the waves, burning through belts of ammunition. He would later speak of firing into the advancing surf for what felt like a lifetime. The scene below was a waking nightmare. Men were drowning under the weight of their gear, landing craft were burning in the shallows, and bodies were getting tangled in the steel obstacles designed to tear them apart. Medics dragged the wounded through a surf that was turning red. For the men in the bunkers, training kicked in. They loaded belts, changed hot barrels, and kept firing. They acted like machines, but inside, they were crumbling. And yet, even as the beach became a killing ground, the invasion didn't stop. More landing craft kept pushing through the smoke. The weight of an industrial empire was landing on their doorstep. Allied destroyers, in a suicidal act of courage, scraped the seabed to get closer, blasting the concrete bunkers with direct fire at point-blank range. Allied tanks crawled out of the surf, their cannons punching holes through the defensive positions. It was then that the defenders realized the awful truth. No armored support was coming for them. No Luftwaffe squadrons were soaring overhead. They were isolated, exhausted infantry, holding a paper wall against a tidal wave of steel. By midday, the psychological collapse was in full swing. American troops were scaling the bluffs, cutting through the wire, and entering the trench systems from the flanks and the rear. The battle inside the bunkers was desperate and brutally personal. Grenades bounced off walls, flamethrowers pushed men out of the shadows, and soldiers fought with knives, shovels, and shattered rifles in the dark corners of their prison. The concrete tombs had become their graves. By then, the survivors understood the grim truth. The tide of the war had turned against them long before that morning. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to survive the next minute. On this day, they were simply witnessing the moment the wall finally crumbled. By the end of June 6th, the beach was secure. But the human cost was staggering. Thousands of American boys lay dead or wounded in the sand. For Franz and the remaining German defenders, the retreat eastward began under a constant rain of Allied artillery and strafing. They marched past the shattered remains of the Atlantic Wall, the fortress now reduced to smoking ruin. They had fought for a regime that had brought catastrophe to the world. They had defended a wall that history demanded fall. Decades later, the bunkers still stand. They sit on the Norman coastline, weathered by salt and rain. Inside, you can still see the wooden plank marks, and even the fingerprints of the laborers who poured the concrete. Nearby, at the German military cemetery, over 21,000 soldiers lie beneath dark stone crosses. The grass doesn't care what uniform they wore. History does not erase the suffering of ordinary men, just because they stood on the wrong side of it. June 6th is frozen in memory as a gray morning without an end. A day when boys inside concrete bunkers watched the sea disappear beneath steel and fire. What happens to ordinary people when they are trapped inside a far larger story? A story of defeat, of victory, of machines, and of fire? That is the real ghost of D-Day. Not the glory of victory, not the bitter sting of defeat, but the unbearable silence of the men who watched the sea vanish.